and a warm welcome to the final session of our online summer series. My name is Ian Rees, and I'm chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. Many thanks for joining us today. Prompted by the Black Lives Matter movement, throughout the summer, we've been reflecting on a range of aspects of the history of race relations in Wales, covering topics as diverse as memorialisation, the anti-apartheid movement, slavery, and the Cardiff race riots. This morning, in this final chapter of Llafur's summer series, we're concluding with a discussion on the life of the great Paul Robeson and his connections to Wales. 80 years after the release of the film The Proud Valley in 1940, we are delighted to welcome today's speakers, Aluko, Mark Rhodes, and Beverley Humphreys, to reflect on a bond forged in the winter of 1929, but which still very much endures today. Before we get underway, just one housekeeping issue. For the past 4 events, we've asked everyone to turn off their camera and mute themselves. For today, the speakers have requested that you turn your cameras on, but keep your devices muted. So could you all please do that now? Thank you. Right, we're going to kick off today's event with a short film clip, which will hopefully help contextualize the ensuing discussion. It is a trailer for the 1940 film The Proud Valley. After this clip, I'm going to leave you once again in the capable hands of my colleague Darren Macy, who will introduce each of today's speakers and chair today's discussion. James, over to you for the film clip.
Good morning all. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the release of Proud Valley, inspired by a short story entitled David Goliath, written by Paul Robeson's friends and fellow activists Herbert Marshall and Frida Brilliant. Proud Valley is steeped in metaphor. But for me, the biggest metaphor is this first one, Robeson's title character, David Goliath. Even his staunchest critics would find it hard to deny that Robeson was a Goliath of the 20th century. A giant of a man, both intellectually and physically, Robeson would spend his life defending the Davids in society. Amongst others, Robeson would be a champion for the American Civil Rights Movement, the Republican cause in Spain, emerging anti-colonial movements throughout the world, and of course, Wales, the struggles of Welsh South Wales miners. With me to discuss Robeson and his legacy in Welsh culture and memory this morning are three wonderful presenters. Our first presenter is the wonderful Beverley Humphreys. Though I could spend all morning discussing Beverley's biography. She's a wonderful presenter, singer, broadcaster, and a humanitarian. Beverley writes and presents her own weekly BBC Radio Welsh programme, Beverley's World of Music, which broadcasts at 9 p.m. on a Sunday evening. She's a former High Sheriff of Glamorgan and is currently serving as a Deputy Lieutenant in Glamorgan. She's a racial justice advocate for URC and is the coordinator of Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition. And if you haven't listened to it, Beverley's got a wonderful 4-part BBC radio series on Paul Robeson. Following Beverley, we'll have Aluko. Teo was born in Nigeria. Previously an architect, his interest in singing eventually overcame his interest in architecture. His one-man play, Call Me Mr. Robeson, has taken him as far afield as northwest territories of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and lots of venues in South Wales and across Wales in general. His second play, Just an Ordinary Lawyer, has been performed internationally and he's currently working on a third. His audiovisual piece, West African History Before the Transatlantic Slave Trade, is a part of a permanent exhibit in Liverpool's International Slavery Museum. He's published in The Guardian, Morning Star, Nerve Magazine, Modern Ghana and Searchlight Magazine. Finally, in a transatlantic link-up which we hope will mirror Robeson and Will Painter, joining us from the United States is Mark Allen Rhodes II. Mark is an assistant professor of geography at Michigan Technical University, where he teaches in the Department of Social Sciences and advises industrial heritage and archaeology to PhD and MS students. His research critically examines the intersections of memory, identity, culture and landscape, particularly in Wales. His ME focused on Paul Robeson's memorialisation in Wales, and in particular, as he continues research in various aspects of Robeson's memorialisation, including his presence on YouTube, Aluko's Call Me Mr. Robeson, and Paul Robeson Heirloom Tomatoes. He is currently working on a book proposal to expand his work on Paul Robeson's memory on a global scale. Beverley, if you'd like to start off this morning's proceedings. 1 second. Beverley, could you unmute yourself, please? There we go. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Fantastic.
I'm so delighted to be here this morning and alongside dear friends and colleagues with a mutual passion, Tayo and Mark, to talk about a man who is very close to my heart. When I first met Paul Robeson Jr. 20 years ago, one of the first things he said to me was, if you get involved with my dad's story, he will never let you go. And it's absolutely true, because 20 years on, Paul Robeson, his life, his voice, his inspiration has never left me. And it's stronger than ever at this moment, as you said, with that phrase, Black Lives Matter, on so many people's lips and in everybody's hearts. More than ever, the world today is in need of a great role model to inspire us, to spur us on, to believe that we can work for a better future. A future where racism is eradicated and where all men and women are considered and treated as equals. Who was this Paul Robeson? An African-American born in 1898 in Princeton, New Jersey, into a world of deep injustice. Racism and hatred of the other was endemic. The son of an escaped slave could hardly hope to make a good life for himself. And yet, he became one of the most significant cultural and political figures of the 20th century. He spent his life trying to make the world a better place. And oh my goodness, what a role model Paul Robeson is for us today. Of course, it's the voice that for most people is their first introduction to Paul Robeson. The richness, the depth, the timbre, the tone, the sound that seems to emanate from his very soul. Once you've heard it, you'll never forget it. But that voice has much more significance than simply the beauty of the instrument. Because Robeson said himself, my voice is my weapon. Every artist must elect to fight for freedom or slavery, and I have made my choice. That was his mantra. His father, a slave, escaped when he was 15 and amazingly went on to be a Wesleyan minister. And Paul says that all through his childhood, it was his father who told him that he should have responsibility not only for his own people, but to care for everyone who was treated unjustly, to realize that suffering and compassion is not confined to a single race. Of course, he turned out to be a brilliant scholar, one of the first African Americans to win a scholarship to Rutgers University, then to go on to Columbia University, to train to become a lawyer. He was a fine athlete, a great American football player, and yet taunted and sidelined and even attacked by his white teammates. He was a great orator, a linguist, went on to become a dazzling star on film, in theatre, and on record. And through it all, he spent his life at the center of the struggle for what he termed as peace, dignity, and abundance for all. Against the odds, he graduated as a lawyer in 1923, but he soon discovered that there were so many obstacles in his way, preventing him from liberating his people through the law as he dreamed of doing. He wasn't even allowed to represent white people in court. So, where was he to go from here? It was a crossroads. Singing then became his weapon in the fight for freedom and justice. He raised the status of the Negro spiritual, gave a recital at Greenwich Village Theatre, singing spirituals as a legitimate art form. It was a sellout, amazingly, a triumph, and he made history. He was the first concert singer, or one of the first, to refuse to sing in front of a segregated audience. He began to change that stereotypical black Sambo image in the theatre. He tried, as well as he could, to do that in Hollywood too. But the directors duped him, and many of his best scenes were left on the cutting room floor. His Othello in London and on Broadway, well, they were legendary. Music theatre too. His portrayal of Joe in Showboat was iconic. Who could ever forget him singing Old Man River? And when he came to the West End in the late 1920s to sing in Showboat in Drury Lane, that was when his strong, loving bond with Wales began. He heard a group of miners singing on a street corner. He was on his way to the Savoy where he was staying. Of course, he wasn't allowed to go in through the front door of the Savoy because he was black. Couldn't even eat in the restaurant next door. But he heard these voices singing and he wanted to know their story. These Rhondda miners who had walked from Wales to highlight what was happening in Wales after the general strike, how the miners' families were suffering. And when he heard what was happening, he paid for a carriage to be filled with clothes and books and food for the Welsh families. And he said to them, I will come. I will come to help you. They could hardly believe it. Would this man really keep his promise? And of course he did. He came to Wales over and over again, singing in concerts all over Wales for miners and for the other good causes. And this loving bond that was forged with the working class communities in South Wales, it grew stronger and stronger throughout his life. And he often spoke very movingly about the debt that he owed to the South Wales mining communities. He said, you've shaped my life. I've learned from you. And I know that I have friends here. Then, wherever he traveled all over the world, from Chile to Australia, he spoke out against exploitation and discrimination of any kind. The 30s, of course, was a very turbulent decade. And during those years, Paul Robeson felt driven by a new political passion. He began to explore socialism. He met kindred spirits like Joe Hill. And he began to believe that his work as an artist had to be tied in closely with his fight against injustice. Fascism was on the increase. He gave all his earnings from his latest play to help Jewish refugees escaping from the persecution in Germany. More and more, he was convinced of the oneness of humanity. In 1937, he appeared at the Albert Hall in London at an event in support of the democratic government in Spain, and he spoke very clearly there. He said, this was something that he had to fight for. Then he came to Wales, to Mountain Ash, to talk to people there. And he said that this was so important to him. And someone who had actually been there and who had fought in Spain described what it was like when Paul went to sing to the brigaders in Spain. He said, there he was in the midst of destruction and war. He was singing to us. And the moment he stopped, we heard again the bullets and the bombs and the shells and all the sounds of war. Paul Robeson's art and politics were now inextricably linked. Arthur Horner, that night in Mountain Ash, the president of the South Wales Miners' Federation, he set the tone. He said, in South Wales, we have always lived for freedom and we will never stop fighting for it. The film Proud Valley that we've heard and seen that little excerpt, and doesn't it whet your appetite for seeing the whole film? That man, that voice. He said that this was the film that satisfied him the most politically and artistically. At last, he was allowed to show the black working man as a true hero with the greatest of human and social values. By the 1940s, his artistry, his humanity, and his passion for equality and peace brought Paul Robeson acclaim all over the world. He began to be one of the most well-known and international singers and film stars. Yet, in America, his own country, his unwavering challenges to racism and injustice often placed him in confrontation with the government. He went personally to the White House to speak to President Truman. In the South, there was an escalation of horrific lynchings by the Ku Klux Klan. He asked, what was the president going to do to stop these brutalities? Then, in the 1950 McCarthy witch hunt, he was accused of un-American activities. His passport confiscated, all rights to travel and sing were refused. But he wouldn't compromise. He would not compromise his beliefs. He had the world at his feet. Imagine it. And yet, he stood up for the rights of the oppressed, and he sacrificed that performing career, and also faced the erasure of his memory from history. Those 8 long years of confinement, because it was 8 years, there were protests from all over the world in the Let Paul Robeson Sing campaign. No voices spoke and shouted more loudly than those in Wales. To show their support and their solidarity, the South Wales miners invited him every year to the Miners' Eisteddfod in Porthcawl. They knew he couldn't come, but they wanted him to know that he was not forgotten. And then, in 1957, only the second live transatlantic telephone link occurred from a small studio in New York. He spoke and he sang to the capacity audience packed into the pavilion in Porthcawl. In turn, he heard, oh, those messages of love and support, and the Treorchy male choir singing, "We'll keep a welcome in the hillside." His son, Paul Jr., said that event helped him so much to revive his spirits during those very dark days. In 1958, when at last his passport was restored, one of his first visits was to Wales, to Ebwy Vale, to the National Eisteddfod. He came at the invitation of the Labour politician Aneurin Bevan, the architect of the NHS. Once again, Britain, especially Wales, embraced him. And that same year, Paul Robeson was the first layperson to read scripture from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral, the first Black person ever to stand at that lectern. The years of repression and attack and constant activity inevitably, of course, took their toll. He'd helped to lay the foundation for the civil rights and Black awareness movement in America and beyond. And he tried to resist the stereotyping. He recreated this positive and iconic role model. In 1965, Paul Robeson withdrew from the world. He lived quietly with his sister Marion in Philadelphia. He died on January the 23rd in 1976, aged 77. His voice, his spirit will never be forgotten in Wales. And when Dr. Howell Francis founded the Paul Robeson Wales Trust 20 years ago, I just jumped at the chance to be part of it. Because the mission of the Paul Robeson Wales Trust is to inspire new generations to believe in and fight for peace, equality, and abundance for all, Paul Robeson's words. And what a privilege it's been. Our fantastic trustees, Harry Ernest and his son Ian, Leslie Clark, Mick Antoniv, and of course, the sadly missed Betty Campbell. And then to spend time with Paul Jr. and his wife Marilyn and their daughter Susan. Susan came to the Eisteddfod in Ebwy Vale to commemorate her father's visit there in 1958. Mair and Howell and myself, we looked after Marilyn when she came 5 years ago, just to be reminded of the importance of Wales to her and her family. And then to be involved with Phil Cope, when he was creating the Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition. What a thrill that was. And that exhibition has travelled all over Wales, to the Covent Garden Museum too, and I took part of it to Philadelphia, and it caused quite a stir, I can tell you there. Because we believe that the exhibition, which is still travelling, not only during Black History Month, but during the rest of the year too, that this exhibition, when people who've never heard of Paul Robeson can be inspired by his story. We want people to be part of that fight against racism and for human rights and international understanding. And you know, it's been especially exciting. I'm so excited I can't speak, to see the reaction of children and young people when they see and hear Robeson's story. Their indignation at injustice is so real. I worked with the Equality and Human Rights Commission on a Croeso project in schools and colleges to stimulate young people to think about their world, how they want their world to be. Do they want fairness and justice and equality? And we used clips from the film to illustrate too. Young people who'd never heard of Paul Robeson, somehow touched by his spirit. A few years ago, I was in America making a series about Paul Robeson for BBC Radio Wales. In New York, on that last day, I interviewed Harry Belafonte. He'd been one of the few people that Paul allowed to visit him during those last years when he was living with his sister in Philadelphia. Life had taken its toll. He was more or less a recluse. Harry asked him whether he'd ever regretted giving up everything for what he believed. When he was telling me, the tears were streaming down Harry's face, and they were mine too. He said that Paul Robeson had answered, "No, I don't regret that, but I do regret not having done enough. I couldn't change the world as I dreamed I would. But my consolation is this. In every generation after me, there will come other men and women who will carry on the struggle." And you know, those words are imprinted on my heart because it is true. People are doing that. Tayo, Mark, the Australian author Jeff Sparrow came to stay with me a few years ago when he was writing his book about Robeson, No Way But This. Dr. Shana Redmond of the University of California came to Wales to research her book about the way that Robeson used music in his fight for equality. And Sir Willard White and I have toured our Paul Robeson tribute concert for almost 20 years. 2 years ago, I was involved in a very small way with Mererid Hopwood and Robert Arwin when they were creating that wonderful piece of theatre for the 2018 National Eisteddfod, Hwn yw fy mrawd, with Bryn Terfel, and the Millennium Centre was full on both nights. Imagine all those people hearing Paul's story for the first time. And so this is what is unique about Paul Robeson. People love him because of his voice and his charisma. And he used that voice and that charisma in the best possible way to fight for a better world, to fight for equality, justice, peace, and abundance for all. And I believe that with all my heart in the oneness of humanity and that we are all connected. We are living now under the dark shadow of Brexit. We're in a post-Trump world. Whatever our politics, I hope that each of us will denounce the insidious tide of racism that has been unleashed. Paul Robeson, his story, his spirit, his energy, live on, inspire us to carry on his struggle. And I believe that he proved that every one of us can play our part, however small. It needn't be on the world stage. It would be very small in our family, in our community, in our workplace. We can play our part in achieving his vision of justice, peace, and equality for everyone. Thank you.
I don't know what to say after that. That's fantastic, Beverley. Really, really moving. I can see a couple of people clapping in the audience there. Absolutely fantastic. Really, really powerful. Just one small piece of admin. Everybody's got a chat function. If you want to ask any questions to Beverley or Teo or to Mark or amongst yourselves, or if you can use that, and then we'll address all the questions right at the end after Mark's presentation. Also, today's event will be finished with Teo giving us a rendition of Joe Hill. So I'll give you all a warning now. If you want to get some handkerchiefs or get something to wipe your eyes with, please do. It's fantastic. Teo, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Beverley, and thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks for the invite. I'd like to start with the quote from the concert that Beverley mentioned, June 24th, 1937 at the Royal Albert Hall. This was a fundraiser for the Spanish Republican movement against the fascist General Franco's army. And Paul Robeson said in a speech, the liberation of Spain from the oppression of fascist reactionaries is not a private matter of the Spaniards, but the common cause of all advanced and progressive humanity. The artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative. Now, I often say that it's remarkable that on a London stage, an African American is speaking out on behalf of Spanish people fighting fascism. And that, for me, thanks to Paul Robeson's initial encounter with the Welsh miners some years before, is a perfect illustration of his internationalism, his solidarity across nations and across races. And there's another quote, not from him, that I would like to use here, which is from a Greek poet called, his nom de plume is Dinos Christianopoulos. And some of you would have heard it before. He wrote, "What didn't you do to bury me? But you forgot that I was a seed." And now you see that these days in demonstrations around the world against oppressive governments. They try to bury us, but they don't know that we are seeds. And for me, that is a good illustration of what Paul Robeson represents. He was somebody that the American authorities tried to bury even before he was dead, long before he was dead. They tried to bury him because he represented such a threat to the status quo in the United States. When I was thinking about what I would say for this presentation, my mind went to the Wales window of Alabama. Now, 1953, yesterday actually, as people probably know, was the anniversary of the speech that Dr. King made, the famous one, "I Have a Dream" speech. But barely 2 weeks later, that same year, a bomb went off at a church in Alabama and killed 4 little girls and injured many more people. And in Wales, there was an artist called John Petts, who, like everybody, heard this terrible news and said, "I've got to do something." And his wife, eventually said to him, "Stop talking about this, do something." And so he started a campaign with a Cardiff newspaper, asking people to raise money, and he would make a stained glass window. And he insisted that nobody was to give more than, I think, half a crown. so that the window would not be, no rich person could claim to have funded the window. And it is said that, there are photographs of queues of children, black and white, in Cardiff, lining up to give half a crown. And the money was raised, and 2 years later, the window was installed in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, I researched John Petts, hoping to see that he said that I was inspired to do this because in 1958 or 57, when Paul Robeson couldn't get his passport, and there was the I stepped for that port call, and he phoned in, like Beverley said, down the transatlantic line, and I was there as a boy, but alas, he wasn't there. But I like to think that the fact that Paul Robeson had made such a mark in Wales, starting in 1929, when he first went, through the years, actually laid the foundation for so many people in Wales being ready to stand up to show the same solidarity that Paul Robeson showed for the Welsh people and other people around the world. That Paul Robeson certainly contributed to people's being so ready to stand up and go and contribute to that memorial that John Petts did. Now, the way I came to Paul Robeson is interesting, and it's illustrative of that thing about they tried to bury me, but they didn't know they were planting a seed. Now, I was born in Nigeria, and from the age of 7, I've sung, in school choirs and so on. And when I came to England at the age of 16, I joined the school choir there, sang in the university choir, started studying architecture at Bath University, sang in the choir there, and then I transferred to Canterbury College of Art. And I found myself, I don't actually remember how this happened, but I found myself singing in the Snowdown Colliery male voice choir. Now, Snowdown Colliery is somewhere out between Canterbury and Thanet, somewhere, I don't even remember where, but I found myself singing a Snowdown Colliery male voice choir. And in 1984, we were due to go to the Eisteddfod in Porthcawl, which was cancelled because there was a miners' strike happening then. After Canterbury, I went to London to work and to carry on studying, and I joined the London Welsh Male Voice Choir. And that's where I really started singing in Welsh. And they have the Festival of 1,000 Welsh Male Voices, where choirs come from literally all over the world to the Royal Albert Hall. And I made sure that I knew the Welsh, because I thought with one black face among 1,000, the cameras would stop on me. So I did the Welsh. And then I came to Liverpool to carry on studying. And then on June 23rd, 1995, I was singing in an event in Sefton Park Palm House, and I sang a spiritual, My Lord, What a Morning. And a woman said to me afterwards, "You remind me of Paul Robeson. Do you sing many of his songs?" And I thought, Paul Robeson. I may have heard the name, but I'm not sure of his music. Now, this is 1995. After first singing with Welsh male voices in 1984, or 83, 84, all that time, in all my singing, in all my association with male voice choirs, if anybody mentioned Paul Robeson to me, it must have just passed over, because when this woman mentioned him to me in 1995, I really didn't know who he was. But then 2 months later, I stumbled on this book in the library, the biography of Paul Robeson, borrowed it and read it, and that literally changed my life. And that's why I'm speaking to you today with posters behind me of some of the places that I've performed in. These two posters happen to have Welsh venues. They're not always on this wall, but they're there. But that's just illustrates the fact that Paul Robeson, somebody who had been buried for decades, was just waiting for me, to discover him and then change my life to such an extent that from being an architect, I'm now an internationally touring actor, singer, having been as far down south as Adelaide and Wellington in New Zealand, and as far up north as Inuvik in the Northwest Territories of Canada. And it also reminds me of the story of 12 Years a Slave. That was a book written, I don't remember the year, sometime in the 19th century, and lay buried for several decades, and then somebody picked a copy up and gave it to her husband to read, and that husband was the director, Steve McQueen, several decades later. Now, John Petts apparently the artist went on to make another stained glass window in Brighton and Hove, the Brighton and Hove Reformed Synagogue. And he made it as a memorial to the Holocaust. This is where it may get a little bit controversial. I would suggest that if Paul Robeson were alive today, if John Petts were alive today, they'll be speaking out, making art about what's happening in Palestine. And they would therefore run the risk of being called anti-Semitic, because that is what has been happening to people who speak out on behalf of Palestine. Paul Robeson was a great supporter of Israel and Jewish people, but I'm pretty sure that if he were alive today, because of his history, he would recognize that the brutality, the brutal conditions, the grave injustice that people of Palestine are suffering today has to be spoken about. Artists have to make art and make art about this. And for me, to finish again with the analogy of seeds being planted, I would say that looking at the United States and looking at the United Kingdom, where the establishment think they have successfully buried figures like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, I would like to suggest that the inspiration that those two gentlemen have given to millions of young people, that what the authorities have done in the same way as they thought they had done so with Paul Robeson, is just plant seeds which will germinate as forces for good, in the same way as Paul Robeson was waiting for the right conditions, the right sunlight and water to sort of sprinkle on my head, which was at that time quite full of hair. But with his story, I've been able to go around the world, hopefully inspiring more people to fight for peace and justice wherever it is. And that's all thanks to Paul Robeson. Thank you very much.
Again, Beverley's clapping and other people, I 100% agree. And I think there's a responsibility on every single person who's listening to all these presentations this morning to take something away from what you've just said. And we can fight this every day in every facet of our life. I get a bit controversial as well, but we've got to fight injustice. We've got to fight this idea of fake news and this sounding chambers we see on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. Sorry, I'm starting to go on a rant now. But yeah, that's superb too. Absolutely superb. Thank you very, very much. Mark, if you'd like to, I have the unfortunate task of following Beverley and Teo.
Yes, I was just about to say that. I have very large shoes to follow. But thank you all so much. Thank you, Beverley and Tayo, especially for your words. I thought I might start with how I came to both Paul Robeson and Wales, because they're actually connected together. I also study music in college. I have a bachelor's in music, and so that's where I was exposed to Paul Robeson. At first was in world music courses. You know, he is the default when it comes to Black spirituals, and so that's, I knew of his music, and as soon as I was exposed to it, I became obsessed in a lot of ways. I mean, just I absolutely loved his music, and as Beverley was saying, just the way that he was able to project in his tone, and so I knew of his music, but I wasn't exposed to anything else. And like most Americans, if they do know of Paul Robeson, it's Old Man River and almost nothing else. But it wasn't until I went to Wales, and I was also a geography student, and my advisor was Welsh. He's Gareth John at St. Cloud State. And he took a group of us to Wales for a study abroad, and it was in the Waterfront Museum. As we were walking around, on the first floor, there's the Achievers Gallery, where they've taken about 100 Welsh achievers and put them in this digital display. And at that time, people could vote, and then the top Welsh achievers would be pulled out and put on the wall on permanent display. And I remember as an American, a young American, reading the description of this gallery, thinking, well, I'm certainly not going to know anyone in this gallery, so I'm just going to come walk on to the next one. And I literally did a double take, because up on the wall in a big display was Paul Robeson. And here I am thinking, what is Paul Robeson doing as a national Welsh hero in the National Waterfront Museum? And that question and that kind of surprise led into my master's research, really asking that question, and asking how Paul Robeson has come to be memorialized in Wales. And I want to share, I can share the screen here. There we go. You should be seeing the image of the Achievers Gallery right now. Hopefully that's what you're seeing. And so this is kind of the digital display, which is permanently, it's still in the Swansea Waterfront Museum. And there's another little section in the National Waterfront Museum in the Communities Gallery that you can find Robeson as well. And so going through very quickly some of the sites around Wales that Paul Robeson has a permanent presence in. It's not actually that many. So he's in the National Waterfront Museum. He is the poster print of Proud Valley is in the National Library, the National Screen and Sound section of the National Library. There is a small display of the Porthcawl Transatlantic Exchange with the record and a small biography in the South Wales Miners Museum. Stop sharing now. The Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition that Beverley was mentioning, which I'm very happy to have been interacting with Beverley and Sean throughout my master's work, and they were very generous enough to give me a number of the publications from Phil Cope's exhibition. And so a lot of that exhibition, that exhibition is archived in the South Wales Miners Library at Swansea University, but some of that permanent exhibition is scattered around the public library as well. Works of art, some of the informational booklets, things like that. But it really is the Porthcawl Grand Pavilion. And again, if I can share my screen, it's the Porthcawl Grand Pavilion. there we go, that has the kind of the largest memorial to Paul Robeson in Wales, a kind of permanent presence of Paul Robeson in Wales. And so it's this Paul Robeson room, which is on the ground floor of the Porthcawl Pavilion if you're coming in from the car park in the back. Which you can see, it's not a large room, but there is a significant presence, not only the name of the room itself, but of course you can see works of art, a bust of called Young Robeson, which is actually Paul Robeson Jr.'s casting, and then these series of panels along the side. And so, of course, I'm not just interested in the sheer presence of an individual. I'm interested in memory and identity and the role of how we come to memorialize someone and the meaning that goes into that. Just as we're seeing in the United States, particularly with like Confederate memorials, it's very clear that memorials are not there for history, right? They're very poor textbooks, to be honest. They're there to, as in the context of Confederate memorials, they were mostly built in the Civil Rights era as a symbol of white supremacy. And just like that, just like most memorials, as James Lowen, the sociologist who's written Lies Across America and Lies My Teacher Told Me, would argue that memorials, rather than signaling some kind of emblem of the past or some kind of historical text, are rather a symbol of their presence is an articulation of the continued value of whatever it is that they're representing. So the fact that we allow a certain memorial to stand is our indication that we're allowing whatever those meanings and identities that are wrapped up into that memorial, we're letting those stand as well. And so that's what's so interesting about Paul Robeson, is because when Paul Robeson is memorialized, it's everything that we've already been talking about, that Tayo and Beverley is mentioned, that gets wrapped up into that memorial. But at the same time, it also is politicized somewhat. And there's no clearer translation of that politicization than the Porthcawl Grand Pavilion's Paul Robeson room. Because so as I went through and was identifying these sites, well, in order to figure out how an individual is politicized, you have to understand that individual very closely in the first place. And so part of my work as a master's student was working with the Pan-African Studies Department, Dr. George Garrison and others at Kent State University. And I actually have an article in the Journal of Black Studies that is solely Paul Robeson's philosophy and his philosophical framework. And it really boils down to things we've already mentioned, of course, his anti-colonialism, his socialism, and his civil rights, his human rights, his fight for against Jim Crow and for integration and for Black lives. So these three kind of cores to Robeson are what we can look at in his memorials. And so are these three aspects of Robeson always present? Are they present equally? Is something forgotten or not, or overemphasized maybe? And so if you're going through the Welsh memorials, there's one thing you might notice is missing. And it really doesn't become so apparent until you go into Porthcawl. And you notice through these panels, there's hundreds of different, just a timeline basically of Paul Robeson's life that's here. And what you get are a number of different aspects of Paul Robeson's human rights. Of course, his fight against everything I've said already, Jim Crow, for integration of Major League Baseball, all kinds of different things that he was doing, fighting against lynching in the United States, as Tayo called, which is still a fight today with the reemergence of the We Charge Genocide campaign, now against police brutality, which was actually an aspect of the We Charge Genocide campaign in the 40s and 50s. But when you get into the Porthcawl Grand Pavilion, you notice that there's through these biographical, chronological points. You have the human rights dimension. You have the anti-colonial dimension. So there's this mention of his fight against or for Indian independence, against Irish oppression, for a number of different independence movements across Africa, and his role in the Pan-African nationalist kind of movement, this ideology. But what you don't get is his fight for labor rights. There's almost no mention of his role in the union. There's almost no mention of his connections to socialism, to the Soviet Union. But what's surprising is that it's not a Welsh memorial. It's produced from Columbia College, Chicago. It's an American memorial. And so, of course, you see that, well, in the United States, having a socialist Robeson is not a safe Robeson to memorialize. And so then when you go back and look at the Welsh memorials, you realize, well, of course, a socialist Robeson is being promoted. Look at the South Wales Miners Museum. They even claim that he was a member of the Communist Party when we don't have clear evidence that he was, even though he was clearly supportive of the Communist Party and a number of active communists on both sides, in Britain and in the United States, let alone his role in the unions, as we already talked about. And clearly there's a role of him in a fight for equality, for civil rights. The Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition is a clear symbol of this idea of a tolerant Wales, of this internationalist Wales. But what you don't find across these different Welsh memorials, and Daniel Williams, a professor of English and literature at Swansea University, has identified this pattern as well, is this absence of any conversation of colonialism in the Welsh memorials, or nationalism, Pan-African nationalism, Welsh nationalism. So at the end of the day, there's this third of Robeson that kind of doesn't emerge in these memorials in Wales, which is interesting because of Wales' role both as a colonized aspect, colonized by England originally, but then also a very active role in the British Empire. And so there's a number of different narratives that kind of get erased from this potential of memorialization in this process. And so that's normally where I would end. That was my master's research, but I'm also very much aware that in 2018 with, and I cannot pronounce this musical very well at all, but the Hwni V Mrod, hopefully it's somewhat close, starts to kind of break that boundary. And I want to end by reading just a little aspect of what my PhD dissertation ended up exploring of the musical and the other events surrounding the 2018 National Eisteddfod in Cardiff Bay. So I'll kind of end with a somewhat substantial chunk of this. Apologies for reading though. One of the most unique performances during the National Eisteddfod was the Hwni V Mrod tribute to Paul Robeson, in combination with the Carnivali Mor multicultural carnival, parade, and film dedicated to the sea and legacy of Butetown, Cardiff's historic immigrant and Docklands community. On the opening night, the use of color and shadow, music, dance, and language was palpable throughout the entirety of Hwni V Mrod. To a packed audience for the first of 2 nights, the musical, a re-dramatization and Welshification, if you will, of the film Proud Valley, tells the story of a boy who's been assigned a project in school to write about a Welsh hero. Mr. Jones, played the music teacher, played by the world-renowned opera star Bryn Terfel, sees the boy struggling and slowly introduces him to Paul Robeson, starting with Robeson's father and mother, and then going on to his time playing football and as a lawyer. The musical slowly builds up to Robeson's Welsh connections, his singing for the miners in London, and his work as an ethnomusicologist, connecting folk songs from around the world. Here, Hwni V Mrod is a literal performance of the nation, and what I can only describe as a creeping celebration of difference, located with the Millennium Center, within the Millennium Center, readily experienced by some as a site of national history and memory. Bringing Paul Robeson into these halls during the National Eisteddfod nonetheless further commits Wales to the narrative of Robeson. In addition, both performances of Hwni Vim Rod sold out long before the week of the Eisteddfod. Additional significance comes from the performing Hwni Vim Rod in the Millennium Center, which, along with the entirety of the Eisteddfod, sits within the electoral district of Butetown, which had Middle Eastern, African, Afro-Caribbean, and African-American immigrant workers settle alongside Welsh and immigrant English, Irish, and others to work at the docks and in other industries. The community became a vibrant narrative of Welshness as they contributed to the great success and development of Cardiff, the valleys, and Wales itself through the coal industry. In this context, performing a tribute to Robeson here brings Robeson in all he represents, Cody or Cysgidion from the Shadows, the 11th song of the musical's repertoire, represented by both a shadowy projection of Robeson weaving its way throughout the musical, and the actor performing Robeson standing watch in the dark corner of the stage. Color plays a similar role in the final and title number. An intermixing of adult and youth choirs throughout the stage slowly turn the stage from a monotone gray, a symbol of Robeson's oppression, to the vibrant purple, which throughout the musical had come to represent Robeson. Meanwhile, Matthew Goh, the actor playing Robeson, returns to the perch corner of the stage, also in purple, and happily joins in the singing. This last bit of symbolism, the slow creep of Robeson's purple narrative throughout the performance, coupled with Robeson's acknowledgement and approval of the musical itself in this final scene, places the audience in a unique position. They not only saw the performances at work in the musical, but they are bearing witness to Robeson himself as the shadowy figure also stares down on the developing musical. This process reinforces the authenticity and power of this purple global Welsh bit of memory work, this process of memorializing Wales in place. Unlike Robeson's other memorials in Wales, using a combination of Welsh language and powerful music, the context of the opening night of the National Eisteddfod places Robeson directly into a discussion of Welsh nationalism. There's no need to state how Robeson may or may not have supported the Welsh language campaigns, since the monolingual musical's Welsh language was in constant contact with Robeson throughout the performance, and renewed interest in making these connections with the Welsh Caribbean immigrants and diaspora seeks to accomplish similar goals of using counterculture and popular culture as anti-colonial expression, as the musical actually also integrated with the carnival on the carnival's first night, the second night of the musical. And I know I've gone a little bit long. There's a good story I like to tell about an individual who kind of witnessed this, but maybe if there's time, I might just kind of stop there. But yeah, I think.
Sorry, Mark, you go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So as the parade, the carnival was coming around in front of the Millennium Center, and the audience from the second night of the musical was streaming out, the Cherokee male voice choir comes out and begins singing just as the Carnivale More settled down, which was comprised of a number of different Afro-Caribbean, African-American, Welsh, other musical groups kind of scattered around this parade. They stop, the Cherokee male voice choir starts up. A man standing next to me is clearly enjoying, well, all the audience kind of turns and starts watching the choir. A man sitting next to me is clearly enjoying the male voice choir. And a few minutes in, we hear the drums start coming, start up again from the parade. And not too long after, the director, the conductor, kind of runs off in that direction. The man next to me says, "Oh, he's going to go shut them up." Because, of course, this is the National Eisteddfod. It's the male voice choir. It's the Cherokee male voice choir that is the representation of Welsh nationalism. That's what's of value right now. And the conductor is going to set that record straight in the soundscape of Cardiff Bay. What surprised him, about 30 seconds later, the conductor comes running back. with the drums behind him and surrounds the Treorchy male voice choir. And they continue playing on in this kind of intermixture. And the greatest thing of this, was by the end, I look over at this individual and he just has the largest grin on his face, because he's seeing this integration of an expansion of this idea of what is Welshness. And I see Paul Robeson's narrative and all these other narratives that are connected into Robeson, the movement today of Black lives throughout Cardiff Bay, throughout the United Kingdom, the United States, and around the world, is able to kind of pick apart some of these nuances that have led to such problems in society today. But I thought that that's one of the most powerful, just that small little observation I had was one of the most powerful events, pieces of research. And it's not even really research, it's an observation from my dissertation. But I think I'll just end with that. And thank you all again.
No, thanks, Mark. Again, that's absolutely brilliant. And we actually run the first of the series was about memorialization. I think that there's a bigger conversation to be had and continues to be had. I think we need to make the wider public understand that stone statues do not represent memorialization, and you're not taking away history by removing it. And the point you made about the statues in the Southern States of America, reinforcing other messages to the civil rights movement rather than being an actual a memorial of the Civil War. So I think that's superb, really brilliant. We've got quite a few questions to go through, so I'm going to try and whistle through these as quick as I can, because I want to give Teo as much time as possible and get everybody time to prepare their handkerchiefs.
I've been watching.
Say it again, sorry. So sorry, Howell's mic's on. So. Thank you, Howell. I knew Howell had to get into the discourse in some way, shape, or form. Couple of questions then. Just tell you, it's one of the later questions. Tell you the memorialization. I think Diane's come up with a great suggestion. Has anybody in Wales suggested a statue for Paul Robeson? And Diane suggests a perfect spot for it, replacing Picton. So, have either you heard of a movement for a statue to be created in memory of Paul Robeson? We kick off with Beverley. Yeah, you need to put your mic back on.
Yes, there has been murmurings about this for many years. Of course, it is extremely expensive. A lot of money would need to be raised. But that's definitely in people's minds, most definitely. So if anybody wants to revive that and help us, that would be wonderful.
Sorry, I had to remove my cat from the table. Sorry, Mark, have you heard any whispers from your side of the Atlantic?
No, I haven't, other than kind of just the, like Beverley said, kind of the general ideas that have been thrown around, but no real movement. But I think it's also important to note that, especially in Cardiff, I'm not sure what the progress has been so far, but as of right now, I think there's still no women statues of any individual non-royal women or non-royal connected to the church or state women memorialized in Cardiff.
Betty Campbell has been memorialized. The one
has that statue actually gone up?
Someone else can tell me that. It hasn't actually yet.
Right. So Betty Campbell will be the first, but I it was
she's
supposed
been
to go up
yeah.
this year, but I don't know if it actually did.
Yeah.
But still, there's also any push to memorialize Robeson would also have to acknowledge the lack of any Black representation or women female representation of memorials in Wales or Britain more broadly.
There is talk, and there has been for many years, of a film, of course, a big Hollywood film. When I was in the States, when I was talking with Harry Belafonte, I met William Greaves there, who was trying to acquire the funding for doing it. And I know Steve McQueen, who has been mentioned earlier, he's very keen to make a film too. So I'm really hoping that, of course, the worry is always the agenda behind. If Steve McQueen is doing it, I'm sure it'll be fine. But one wonders about the agenda sometimes behind things. And I suppose we have to just hope and pray that if it were made, it would be made with the right agenda, as it were, the right heart.
It's sad to say, if I may come in, that I've heard that the Steve McQueen proposal for a film sort of hit the barriers, hit the buffers, and currently it's not looking like it will happen. But hopefully something will happen at some point. I mean, I've had ideas for a screenplay about Robeson for a while. I may need to wait to get more famous to be able to do it. But there has also been talk about memorializing Paul Robeson in the United States as a statue. It's just an idea, but I and other people have thought that the best place for that to be would be in Peekskill, the town in upstate New York, which was the site of what can only be described as a fascist riot when he went to sing in August and September 1949. It's probably unlikely that will happen, but you never know. You can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Joel is continuing to be a theme. You segue into that last song excellently so far, Teo. Just to explain how I know Teo, I got to know Teo through a mutual friend called Will Kaufman. Will does Woody Guthrie, who was president of Peekskill as well, and I guess it's that thread of music and memorialization and cultural memory that's I've known Teo for a number of years. Coming back to something Teo said, it's a question around there. It's a little bit nuanced. Jane has asked, Paul Robeson was a supporter of the Jewish people, again, coming back to Will slightly. Was he a supporter of Israel? I've got my own opinions. I'm sure you three would have a similar opinion. Teo?
Yes, I think he was. In fact, somebody sent me a photograph some years ago of a wall in a park somewhere, I don't remember where it is now, somewhere in Israel, which was clearly on land taken from Palestinians. And this was now a park for, presumably Palestinian people would not be welcome in that park. And that park, the funding for that park was international. And there's a wall on the park sort of thanking donors from across the world. And there are two names on that wall, Martin Luther King Jr. and Paul Robeson. The person who sent it to me is a pro-Palestinian activist and saying, what do you think about this, And first of all, I was surprised. But then, having learned a lot more about Paul Robeson, I mean, first of all, his wife was Jewish. His mother was partly of Jewish descent. His son married a Jewish woman. So his grandchildren are partly Jewish, or are Jewish. And for me, Paul Robeson's affinity and solidarity with Jewish people came as from the biblical stories. These were oppressed people. Like his people in the United States and in Africa were oppressed. And if they sought refuge somewhere else, that was totally understandable. So he supported, that he acted in solidarity with Jewish people, especially because, as I understand it, the foundation of Israel was based on Zionism as it was conceived, as I understand it, I'm no expert, was a socialist enterprise. And he was definitely in support of all that. Now, how much he knew about what the Palestinian people were suffering is debatable, and I don't know. But as I said, I would like to think, and I'm pretty sure, that with the amount of knowledge that we have today of how Palestinian people are being oppressed, he would stand by them and criticize the state of Israel, the politicians of Israel, for what they're doing, and again run the risk of drawing condemnation from many quarters, especially from people who he thinks love him. But that's exactly what happened to him, even from the the black people in the United States. And I actually did an essay for Radio 3, Paul Robeson in 5 songs. And the song that I chose to write about was Zognit Kainmal, which was a song that he sang in Moscow in 1949. So yes, he did support Israel, but I would suggest that he supported it without having the full knowledge of exactly what was going on.
Beverley, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I think this is multi-layered, isn't it? And nuanced. As Tayo said earlier on, sometimes if one criticizes the state of Israel and things that are done, one is accused of being anti-Semitic, which is not true at all. And so none of us is perfect. None of us has a perfect knowledge of everything. That the consequences of the things that we believe in or we work for. But I believe that, as Tayo said, Paul Robeson would be as supportive for the Palestinians who are being victimized and treated unjustly as he would have for anybody else. And that would not make him anti-Semitic, but it would make him, as his father told him, to support everyone who is being treated unjustly in the world.
Mark?
Yeah, I agree with what both Tayo and Beverley have said. I don't know of anything specific. I've been cheating as they've been speaking, of course.
I thought so, to be honest. I thought so.
The Paul Robeson speaks up here, looking in the index for Israel references, and there is no overt kind of support that Robeson kind of threw that publicly. Other than what Tayo mentioned, that he kind of in his speeches threw behind Israel, at least from what I can see, and it's more the Jewish people. He's connecting it, particularly in one of his speeches, to Peekskill, as Tayo Aluko is talking about, and the prominent role, because Peekskill was a fundraiser for unions of New York, which of course would have had a strong Jewish presence, but he's connecting his connection between Black and Jewish people in the United States fighting fascism, and that's kind of the connections he's making here. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, coming back to what I said earlier, I think it's a responsibility of everybody in this kind of conversation is to try and speak to the wider public and explain that things are nuanced, and that it's not just a case of right and wrong and left, So yeah, it's really important. Right, I think I don't think we got time for any more questions. I'm sure if there was lots more questions, we'd be happy to have another session, and I just love to hear you three speak again, to be honest. So Tayo, can I hand you over to you?
It looked to me like Howell was wanting to get in.
Oh, sorry. Howell?
Thank you, Darren. Oh, brilliant presentations from everyone. I just wanted to make an observation of Mark's presentation, which I thought was very challenging. And he raises the issue about no mention of labour rights. I think you've misunderstood that exhibition in Bridgend in Porthcawl. I don't think, as you rightly said, it's an American exhibition. So I don't think you can necessarily conflate that across to a Welsh exhibition. The only authentic memorialization, it's a word that we haven't used until recent times, of course in Wales, is the Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition. And it has the authority of the Paul Robeson Wales Trust, the trade union movement, etc. If you were wanting to look at any memorial, it is that memorial. And and as Paul Robeson Jr. said when he opened it in Cardiff, this is the Paul Robeson exhibition, meaning not in Wales, but across the world. And if you look at Paul Jr.'s two marvelous volumes of his father's biography, these two here, when Paul spoke about these works and about his father, he said, to coin the phrase of the other great book about Paul, The Great Forerunner, he said, in order to understand my father, it's not about shaking hands, it's about two fists coming together, the Black movement and the Labour movement, right? And I think that in Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition, you have that authenticity, and you have it, and the question of labour rights isn't about domestic labour rights. South Wales miners had exactly the same ideology and vision of the world through socialism, namely that you fight for all workers, whether they are at home or internationally, whether they are Jewish, whether they are Spanish, whether they are South African. And I think that the problem that I have with Mererid's play, which I discussed with her at length several times, and I've watched, I wasn't there, is that there is somehow or other you got lost in this kind of trying to connect Welsh culture and language with the current, what Paul Jr. dismissed as, this is not me dismissing it, he dismissed current Black nationalism of his era. He said that his father was not a nationalist in that sense. It's a very difficult concept to deconstruct, of course. And Daniel and I have discussions about this, amicable discussions, but we differ. And I think that you've spoken too much to Daniel about this and to Mererid possibly. I think you need to speak more to those of us who are involved in the Paul Robeson Wales Trust and to Phil Cope and others who made that exhibition, because that is the authentic exhibition, and that is the authentic relationship between Paul and Paul Robeson, and being tuned into it, and Wales.
Thank you, Howell. And I think I might have misspoken a little bit, because I agree with that last part. I disagree. I would say he is a Pan-African nationalist, but yes, I think I do need to speak with some more folks from the Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition. But as far as the difference between the exhibition and the Paul Robeson room, one of the biggest kind of differences is that the Let Robeson Sing exhibition was temporary, and there's still the touring mobile exhibition, and if it was still there, I would be speaking at length of it. I actually have an entire article I wrote in the journal Memory Studies about the kind of curation of it and how innovative it was as an exhibition. It is an absolutely brilliant exhibition. I'm not speaking against it. And the quote you say from Paul Robeson Jr.
We've got to correct that, and it hasn't been erased. It's there. It's living. It was in Mountain Ash last year. It reappears.
Yes.
You are right.
Can I speak? Right. Can I say something?
Of course.
Please. Funnily enough, this very last week, I've started discussions with the people in the pavilion in Porthcawl for doing something different, something bigger there. Not to replace what's there already, but hopefully to enlarge it and, yes, make it perhaps, well, make it have the same spirit as our Let Paul Robeson Sing exhibition. And Howell is quite right. I mean, I look after the touring exhibition. It's everywhere. Or at the moment, I'm afraid, it's in Heath Hospital in Cardiff, because that's the last place I had it, and they're storing it there for me during COVID. But that exhibition, the touring one, is used throughout the year. And will be hopefully again this Black History Month. So it's very much alive, and hopefully there will be something different happening in the pavilion of Porthcawl through their instigation, actually. So let's hope. Let's hope.
Right, right. Yeah, and I was just referring to the full exhibition, which allowed, you know, participation from the audience and writing on the walls, of interacting in the
Yes.
spaces of Robeson singing. That's where the full richness of the exhibition came from. Rather, I mean, the panels are excellent and they're powerful panels and powerful information. But the true power of the exhibition comes from the interactivity, the participation, the mobility, and the other aspects of it.
Yeah.
And it'd be great if you could integrate something like that into Porth Call on a permanent basis. I mean, that'd be wonderful.
Yes. Well, you know, that may be slightly too ambitious, but who knows? I mean, I'm an eternal optimist, so you never know what will happen. But also, I do want to add too that when we take the portable exhibition around, I usually incorporate schools coming to see it and have a discussion, and then the children, and sometimes if we have enough money, we have a poet who works with the children in school and getting their ideas that have been that the exhibition has been the catalyst for their own ideas. So although it's portable and it's of course not this monumental, magnificent exhibition that we had originally, it's not static. It lives and it changes its life in whatever context we show it, whether it's a church or a community hall or a school. And in the same way as we've been saying, Robeson is alive in it. Wherever we take it, it is incredible. You feel that his spirit is there. He's alive in it. And so it's living, it's not static, it's growing, it's evolving all the time. And wonderful to have all these energies today, because I do believe in the power of energy and thought. So who knows what's next?
Right, I think we're going to have to cut it off there, although, you know, socialism and nationalism and internationalism, that's one for me and you to discuss. Well, I'd probably disagree on a few things there. I pick it up on Beverley's point. You can't kill what couldn't compromise. Theo, Joe Hill.
Okay. Joe Hill, there will be one or two people who don't know who Joe Hill was. A Swedish immigrant to the United States, late 19th century, and because he was such a powerful organizer, he was framed for a murder charge and executed by the copper bosses. So this little extract from Call Mr. Robeson is reenacting when he couldn't travel even to Canada, so he went to the border. The unions arranged a concert at the border in Washington State, the British Columbia, and across the border were 25,000 people listening to him. And he makes a speech: "Comrades, I cannot act or sing in any sort of decent place in my own country, and yet the British actors have sent a request saying that they would welcome me in England to play Othello. And at the same time, I have received an invitation, and no invitation could mean more, from the workers, the miners in Wales, where I first understood the struggle of Negro and white together, to appear in a festival over there in October, and I very much hope to be able to get there to do that. And why do they take my passport away? They said that I had been struggling for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa, and that is meddling in the foreign affairs of the United States government. Now that's too bad, because I'm going to have to continue to meddle. And I want everybody in the range of my voice to hear, official or otherwise, that there is no force on earth that will make me go backward 1,000th part of 1 little inch." And now, comrades, brothers and sisters, Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, "But Joe, you're 10 years dead." "I never died," says he. "I never died," says he. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe. I didn't die. Says Joe, I didn't die. Joe Hill ain't dead, he says to me. Joe Hill ain't never died. Where working folk defend their rights, Joe Hill is at their side. Joe Hill is at their side. I dreamed I saw Big Paul last night, alive as you and me. But Paul, says I, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. Thank you.
That's fantastic. I can hear my wife clapping downstairs, so you must be good. Absolutely amazing presentation. And I think, as we've said a number of times, some really thought-provoking stuff there between three absolutely superb speakers. I'd like to thank the three of you for being involved this morning. It's been a brilliant event. I hope everybody else thinks so. So I'll hand you over to Ian to wrap things up.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Indeed, that was absolutely fantastic. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to extend a grateful thanks once again, Darren, for chairing, to Tayo, Mark and Beverley for offering us such powerful and deeply moving testimonies into the life of Paul Robeson and his connections to Wales. My tissue box is a little empty. Many thanks also to you, the audience, for your comments and questions via chat. Grateful thanks also to James, Darren, Sean, Colin and Matthew for helping organise the event. As I said at the start, today's session concludes our summer series of online events. I really hope those of you who've been able to join us for a number of these events have found them enjoyable and stimulating. I know I have. Hopefully, they will have inspired you to subscribe to Llafur if you're not yet a member. Details of how to join can be found on our website. This September, we are celebrating Llafur's 50th anniversary. To mark this special occasion, our President, Howell Francis, is seeking to collate as many photographs as possible which chart the 50-year history of Llafur. He's shared a great photo of three of the founding members on our website. I don't know, Sean, whether you were going to show that photo. Doesn't matter if... okay. He has asked that if any of you have any other photos that you share them with him. Again, details of how to do this are on the Llafur website. So do have a look. Also, if you've missed any of this summer's events, or if you'd like to listen to them again, we're in the process of uploading recordings of them. Links to our newly created Llafur YouTube channel containing the recordings will be available soon via the Llafur website. So do keep an eye out for these too. We're going to take a break of a month or so now, but hope to be back in early October with a further series of online talks and discussions. Again, details will be emailed out to members and publicised on our website and Twitter page as soon as they're available. It only remains for me to say thank you once again for your support, and we look forward to welcoming you back in October. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.